So it is that time of the month, everybody. Regulation Central, presented by Polunsky Beitel Green. I have a quick public service announcement before I go off screen in my Darth Vader hood here. Matthew VanFossen is going to be hosting for us. He's much more well-versed on regulatory matters than I am. I think it will contribute to the overall flow of the show in a much more positive way. I know he's very zealous about these topics, and he can also bring some level of expertise in running his own mortgage company and how they influence that. Before I go, I do want to say a big thank you to Polunsky Beitel Green. I love you guys. I can't always give those testimonials. I appreciate Polunsky Beitel Green is committed to sponsoring the show through 2025. I enjoy the team, whether it's talking to Marty or Peter or Jay, or talk to Alan. I've talked to Andy, Dwayne, a bunch of people over there. Great stuff. If you'd like to know more, go to mortgagelaw.com. It is the preeminent law firm for residential mortgage lenders for basically half a century at this point. They're all about legal support for residential mortgage lenders. Give them a check, like I said, mortgagelaw.com. Matthew, I'm going to cede the stage to you and fade to black here. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great show.
Thanks, Robbie. All right, Brian and Peter. So I got a couple of questions for you. You know, we have an administration change coming up, and we're all really involved in Washington constantly what's going on down there. But I think that this administration is going to bring in some curveballs. So I want to talk about it a little bit. Let's talk about what's going on X right now. Vivek. So Vivek has been making some public commentary about the CFPB, and I have a couple of tweets here, or I guess we're calling them X posts now, that he put up going back to 2023. He's been talking about abstain-ably abolishing the CFPB. In fact, he said that, they're not appropriately funded. And not only could we see CFPB get abolished, but we can also see, a lot of things in the wake of Chevron. Now, we know that there's been findings in the past year and cases that have come out that kind of said, well, the CFPB is constitutional in its form, and it got a pass. So what are your thoughts on DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, in relation to what these non-government employees, I guess they're de facto advisors to the federal government, are going to be looking at with agencies that affect our business like the CFPB?
Yeah, Peter, I don't know if you want to go first or not.
You can, Brian, if you want. Yeah. You can go first and I'll follow up, but I have thoughts too, so up to you.
Okay. Well, I did do my last mortgage musings on the topic of a serious proposal or not. And I guess my message from that is, why are these guys acting so silly about something that I think really should be taken seriously, which is government efficiency and regulatory overreach and all of that. I'm not in the camp that thinks that it's realistic that, you're just gonna, with, by the power of personality, be able to get rid of, CFPB and FDIC. I've seen them even talk about getting rid of the FDIC. And, I think, first of all, some regulation is really good and needed for the financial services industry. And I think we've seen that with the excesses of, the subprime era, that we can kind of dig our own grave. And so, having some guardrails in place can be very helpful and productive to our business. But, an agency that's supposed to be staffed by people that are unpaid, working 80-hour weeks with the top 1% of IQ, makes me wonder about what an IQ test actually tests if you're going to take that job.
Right. It's interesting. We've been seeing community notes step in sometimes on Vivek's posts. He put up one that said CFPB started under Elizabeth Warren less than 20 years ago, and consumers are no better off. And then community notes came in and said CFPB has helped get over 17.5 billion back into people's pockets from things such as bank unauthorized accounts and illegally charged fees. So I agree that the CFPB has a purpose. I really do. I think that it would be troublesome for us to unwind everything that we've gone through. You know, do we like every provision of Dodd-Frank or the SAFE Act? No, but there's definitely stuff that we've put in place that just seems common sense at this point. We wouldn't want to see unlicensed origination anymore. But I do think that we want to see some changes to potentially MLO compensation policies. Maybe some of the policies were overreach. And I think that, you know, as an industry, we're going to have to figure out how to get our message through to some of these new agencies as they pop up, and, you know, do those efforts through MBA. So what extreme measures could a group like DOGE actually cause in the industry? Let's say that they do have some type of influence. What's the most extreme do you think that they could get to? Would we see without legislative action, right? Because you know, how far would they be able to expand efficiency power? Is it budget cuts? Is it influence over rule by enforcement? Where do you see they could have influence over a potential new director?
Yeah, and I'll follow up with sort of the previous topic too. You know, Vivek's and Elon's tweets. You know, Elon tweeted that he wanted to delete the CFPB. I mean, it's all very big picture stuff, but
Yeah.
you're right, Matthew. There's a lot of structural impediments to doing that. And I think at the end of the day, you know, you mentioned like revising MLO comp. Like, is that something? I mean, it's fairly granular in the big picture that Vivek and Elon are really going to want to get into the weeds on. And, you know, or is it just going to be these sort of large pronouncements that we're going to have a return to work policy, you know, and if you don't come back to work, you're fired as a federal employee. We're going to eliminate these, you know, agencies. It's like, it sounds great, but it's when you get down to the brass tacks of it, it's very difficult to actually do in a, you know, a constitutional and statutorily compliant way. So to turn to the second part of that, it's like, what could they do? You know, I think probably, like I mentioned, is that if they do try and enforce these return to work policies, they could really see, you know, a reduction in the scope of the federal workforce, either people being fired or simply deciding that, you know, they would rather go work in the private sector. Because for a lot of people, especially the more valuable employees, they're probably giving up money to work for the federal government. And part of that is maybe improved conditions or job security. But if you don't feel you have that, then you might be out. And so I think that sort of runs against the idea of like improving government efficiency if you just have sort of a mass exodus of employees, because it might make certain aspects of the government be much less efficient if they're not properly staffed.
Sure.
Beyond that, I think you're right about regulation through enforcement too. If they hold sway and have Trump's ear, and then he in turn puts pressure on the heads of agencies to roll back enforcement of the rules and regulations, well, that can be like easily done. You know, a lot of laws and statutes don't have private causes of action. So if the regulators aren't going to enforce them, then there's no enforcement.
Well, we could see, you know, potential staff cutbacks, right? They may not have resources to enforce it.
That too, yeah. If everybody in, you know, your enforcement department is leaves or is fired, but there's no enforcement.
So I guess that goes into the next topic, which is, you know, changes. Inevitably, every time we have a new administration, you know, the director does serve at the will of the president, I guess. And we anticipate that Chopra will resign. So let's talk about Chopra a little bit. What's Chopra's legacy? If Corduroy's legacy was rule by enforcement action, right, and being a walking with a big stick with the mortgage industry and having our targets on his back, and Mulvaney was disruption by renaming it, and Carringer was a time of almost peace and solitude, where it was like, hey, we're going to listen, we're going to make adjustments, but we're not your enemy. You know, what defines Chopra? Will his legacy be?
Well, he's been very ambitious, and that ambition has taken a while to kind of materialize. But in the last 6 or 10 months or so, I mean, the CFPB has been incredibly busy with new rules and interpretations and enforcement actions and all kinds of things that, you know, were kind of on the wish list for the last 4 or 5, I guess it would be 4 years that he's been in place. Maybe 3 by the time the confirmation process got through. But in any event, I think there's a lot of things that are now getting rushed that, kind of out the door because they sort of sees the writing on the wall that
Right.
he's not going to be around. The interesting thing for me about that transition process, well, one of the interesting things is that I think I'm kind of surprised we haven't heard about a nominee for the position. And I'm wondering if there isn't some concern about, the relationship of this DOGE entity to the CFPB. And, he's saying, Elon's saying, let's delete it. And then somebody else is, do I want that job, for an agency that's going to be deleted? So there may be some issues there that sort of need to get resolved. And I think we'll sort of find out between now and inauguration a little bit more about the role of DOGE in the relationship to these existing agencies.
Now, to take a step back for a second, we can all agree that the CFPB can't be deleted, right? That would take legislative action and unwinding of a lot of things that have happened over the past 15 years. We just can't have a new administration come in and delete that government agency.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's really possible, but you could certainly put somebody in place that says, eliminate all regulation by enforcement,
Yep.
make an announcement that if it's not in the statutes or the validly promulgated regulations, that it's not an interpretation. We're not
Right.
going to enforce things that aren't in the law.
So you can more or less abstain handcuff the bureau into saying, hey, we're gonna go into hibernation mode almost, where they're not out there hunting. Now, what I would say is probably not good for the mortgage industry is pendulum swings of regulation. Because 4 years goes pretty fast. It feels like 2020 was only yesterday. And I don't think that's healthy for the mortgage industry that we get pendulum swings of, okay, we're in an enforcement era, we're in a non-enforcement era. We historically we haven't adjusted that well to quick changes like that. So it's something that I'm hoping is not going to happen.
Yeah,
But
I think where you'll see the quickest action is maybe pulling back some of the advisory opinions and anything that doesn't have to go through the Administrative Procedures Act, so formal rulemaking. To your point about the pendulum swing, Matthew, we saw that with sort of the abusiveness standard, and it's still ill-defined. And Trump's Project 2025, well, I guess it's not his, but Project 2025, one of the things they called for in addition to sort of abolishing the CFPB was that if you don't do that there should be a definition of the unfair, deceptive, and abusive standard. And it's kind of amazing that we're almost 15 years on now, and it's still unclear what abusive practices are.
Yeah.
Are we going to get anything more definitive, or is the pendulum just going to swing back on that? I think it's unfortunately probably the latter. I think that they'll just sort of, leave it amorphous. But beyond
Peter,
that,
that pendulum really is a pendulum. Like,
yeah,
they actually issued a regulation under Craniger around what the meaning of that was, and then under Chopra they revoked it. So it's sort of like that's a great example of a pendulum.
Yeah, and I think, obviously compliance attorney, and I'm sort of like a guy who likes rules, but I like rules to be, consistent, and that I can advise my clients that, in 5 years, this will probably be the same. It's difficult whenever, like we're talking now, that a new administration comes in and you say, well, you have to be ready because there could be a change in interpretation and you may need to change your practices. And I know that, my clients would just appreciate to have a consistent rule and to know that, okay, once this is sort of settled, then I can move on to something else in my business.
Yeah.
I think the big question is really who gets appointed as a director. Are they someone that sort of, understands how the bureaucracy works, understands how to actually in sort of like through the APA process and in a constitutionally consistent manner, like steer the agency in their direction? Or are they going to be someone who sort of just tries to tear it all down, is immediately sort of challenged in court, and then you have stays and injunctions, and then we're sort of in this like standstill for 2 years while everything gets litigated?
So, I mean, I'm hearing a very Mulvaney-esque. I feel like he kind of came in like that
It could be. And I mean, you think
got
about it,
into
he spent a lot of his time, trying to get the name changed.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, but is that really the best use of your time? If you really believe that the CFPB, as it is currently structured and currently sort of, pointed, is wrong, and you want to change that direction, you need to sort of be someone who knows how to understand how to do that through the existing bureaucratic system, I think. And that'll be the sort of question with DOGE is how much are Elon and Vivek just going to try and blow it up and say, regulation statute be damned. We're just going to do what we want to do. And if you want to challenge us, fine. But we don't feel constrained by sort of existing statute. I mean, Vivek mentioned in his tweets, he talked about overruling of Chevron and the major questions doctrine. And his whole point there was that these agencies have passed rules that, exceeded their statutory authority. It's, well, under the Administrative Procedures Act, it's like, well, that act has provisions for rescinding a rule. But is DOGE just going to argue, or Trump will then, that, well, since these rules exceeded the statutory authority, we don't even need to go back through APA to rescind them. We're not going to enforce them because they have no force of law. And I don't really know where you go there. I think there will be court challenges, and that'll be sort of a novel problem to work through in the courts.
Yeah, look, I think the whole DOGE thing is very consistent with what we're seeing in the Trump administration sort of nomination process, that everybody that's being nominated to sort of lead an initiative is largely being selected on the basis of their ability to, give public statements, appear in the media, amplify the message, and not necessarily to cut through the bureaucratic tape and red tape and make things happen in a government bureaucracy. That's not what they're being selected for, at least not yet. Or maybe some of the initial ones were. I'm just finding it very interesting that's where they're putting their emphasis on in terms of the type of person that they want to lead these different government organizations and agencies.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about who's in the running for the next director in a couple of minutes, but I want to talk about Chopra a little bit more and some of his policies. There was some stuff that he did that I liked. I liked this kind of war on junk fees. Maybe not so much the title section of it, but I have been very interested in some of his commentary on credit. He's been very aggressive on FICO. He had this concept of tokenizing a consumer credit report too, where a consumer can go get their free credit report from their provider, like freecreditreport.com. They get a token, he was calling it. I call it a reissue key. And then they can securely share that reissue key with multiple lenders rather than having their credit report pulled and having all these FICO price increases that lenders are dealing with. This hits your clients' pockets. What of Chopra's policies are going to carry through? I think that talk about government efficiency, lower costs, stuff like that. I'm going to say that actually was a good one on his list. Is there anything that comes to mind of his current policy that we can see the next administration actually carry through with?
Well, I think your point about junk fees is a good one. I mean, look, 90% of the people in the country are opposed to junk fees.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who are the 10% that are in favor of it? But really, that's the polling number. So if you're going to be a financial regulator who's fighting against junk fees, well, you're going to get the support of the population. The details of what is a junk fee and what is something that is necessary to a transaction, that's stuff that people don't want to think about, don't want to worry about. But we can all agree that junk fees are a terrible thing. I mean, frankly, the industry should be embarrassed that they actually called it that themselves, and I know from being in-house, 25 years ago, we had junk fees. We would just call them junk fees. Well, that was really bad from just a optics perspective. And So we ought to be ashamed of that, but fees, are necessary in a lot of transactions. So,
Yeah. So, the war on junk fees, you do foresee it could continue as an initiative through the next administration inside of the department?
sure. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
and I think
that's a fair.
what was interesting about that, and I think, going back to Chopra's legacy, is that you saw a reduction among some of these fees by providers without any formal rulemaking, just whenever Chopra started using the bully pulpit and sort of, jawboning companies into reducing these fees. So I think that is part of his legacy, is that he was a pretty good, effective communicator at sort of cajoling industry into taking action without really any direct enforcement action. And we saw that it's not really the mortgage space, but the overdraft rule, they just published a final rule, but a lot of banks reduced or eliminated the overdraft fees just whenever he started talking about it. And I think that'll be a big part of his legacy, is sort of realizing that there's a lot of sort of persuasive or maybe threatening power that you can accomplish things without actually taking any definitive like statutory or other action. As in the mortgage space, what will carry through, I'll be interested to see if they try and get out the final mortgage servicing rules before, because there is a provision called the Congressional Reauthorization Act. It's like the CRA, that with
Review Act.
Congressional Review Act. See, I've known it as the acronym for too long. But any sort of final rules that are passed within, I think it will basically be August 1st, can be rescinded or sort of terminated by just a simple majority act of Congress. And the question is whether the Republicans will want to overturn this if it gets issued. And although the initial rule was not perfect, and there's a lot that industry had complaints about, it was probably, I think, overall an improvement over the existing structure, and there's sort of wide agreement that we need something. So I could see that actually sort of carrying through. And because you need servicing, like it just exists, there will be more effort by a subsequent director to maybe supplement that rulemaking, but not totally undo it. I think Chopra's biggest legacy, though, is maybe outside the mortgage space, sort of bringing additional participants under CFPB supervision enforcement, the fintechs. And that'll probably continue, especially because you have depositories and more traditional lenders that objected to the fact that they were subject to these rules and regulations that other, like payment providers and lenders were not. But beyond that, what will be undone? In the mortgage space, I'm not sure a lot. The hope really, as you mentioned earlier, Matthew, is that the LO comp rule gets a second look, because I think, at least from a day-to-day standpoint, that's a rule that, it doesn't make sense in every situation. It seems counterintuitive a lot of the time, and really, needs to be fixed, and is something that, industry has long advocated for. And I think can be done in a way that's also sort of like more beneficial to the consumer, in terms of loan officers officially being able to, reduce their compensation in certain scenarios beyond what they can today.
Yeah,
ahead,
NBA has a initiative around RESPA reform.
Mm-hmm.
I think it will commence a long time ago. I don't think anticipated with any certainty that we would have the administration that we're going to have in doing that. But I think that they were trying to think ahead and modernize RESPA. Whether that will carry any traction, I don't know. Again, I think LO comp. I agree with you, Peter. I think it's got a better case for elimination and reform than even RESPA, because it's just just because of the issue of the inability of loan officers to reduce their own compensation to compete. That just seems very counterintuitive, very anti-consumer. And so someone would say, well, why do we have this rule? That's easier than explaining RESPA and the conflicts of interest that is supposed to prevent.
It's going to be interesting to see some of NBA's initiatives. I know we had the 3 provisions of MLO comp reform with the famous NBA letter dating back to 2017. And under Carringer, it looked like we had it on the agenda, and then she got knocked out of office. So we were getting close, and I know NBA really can go for a win right now. We know what happened with the triggers bill being removed from the Defense Authorization Act. So that education campaign has to start all over. So the big question is, what are going to be the major initiatives of NBA, of our industry advocacy groups like CHLA? And I do think that MLO comp is going to be some low-hanging fruit that they're going to target. Now, I don't think that we can eliminate it entirely. I believe there is a statute that requires something to be in place. So I already saw a lot of pitchforks and torches out there saying, eliminate it completely. But what's probably more likely is the demonstrative price competition, where loan officers can lower their wages by showing or proving the consumer shopped and was negotiating. The provisions for HFA loans, the Housing Finance Agency loans, to have a deferred comp plan or a carve out like they are on the HELOCs and the open-ended seconds. And then the material errors one, that when loan originators cause intentional buybacks or material repeat offenders, that they could be penalized. So we'll see what happens with MLO comp, but I do think that we're going to see some weight behind that, and I agree on the RESPA reform too. The RESPA turns 50 report that NBA released, and I guess they did an entire I don't call it an op-ed, but they did a pretty detailed review of RESPA and modernizing it. We're going to see if they can get that in front of the right eyes. So it's going to be interesting to see from the advocacy side where we go through.
Yeah, I mean, sitting here right now, I don't think I have a good feel for where the MBA's priorities are going to be. I think they're probably internally having some discussions about, well, what do we think we can accomplish now, knowing, what the situation is, and maybe they're also waiting to see what happens with the appointment of the CFPB director and DOGE.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what? They had a couple of wins this past year. I think the Basel III was a big win, getting that knocked down. I think what we did with LLPAs and FHFA going back 2 years ago, that was a really big win. So there's been wins under the current administration. We just got to see where they set their eyes on, and you know how Washington works. If you ask for 10 things and you get one, you're winning, right? So with Brian, you mentioned the new CFPB director. So who's in the running? I have two names that I think are out there. Let's discuss it. I think Brian Johnson is in the running. And
So Brian was he was the deputy director under
Yep.
Kranger. And I believe he's back right now at a law firm, or maybe is it like a consulting firm, like a Potomac?
Yeah, he's definitely on the private side. I think he just took a new job, so that will be questionable, especially like we were talking about earlier. If Vivek's out there saying I'm going to burn it all down, I don't know if somebody's going to want to jump out of a new job to go head up the ship for that. But he would be a good choice just because he was the deputy director.
Somebody in the chat suggested that I should be selected as the CFP director. I can confirm here, this is a breaking news. I have not been asked, nor has anybody contacted me about it.
But if you were asked, what would you say?
First of all, that's not, I've never even yeah, I'd probably say yeah. I mean, what an opportunity to work in government. There's all the issues with people in the Trump administration. I don't want to, there'd be all kinds of questions. What would it do to my family? But public service opportunities like that don't come around every day. So I would probably say yes, but I don't see it. The chances of it are zero.
Well, next time I'm at Mar-a-Lago, I'll tell him to throw your name in the hat.
Yeah.
That might be enough,
Yeah.
Well, all you have to do, if they want to find out what I'm going to do, they just read my musings, and then they're right there in black and white.
No, there was some interesting reporting in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal over the last week that didn't really name names, but said that top contenders for financial regulators like the CFPB or prospective nominees are sort of taking their names out of the hat. precisely because you have DOGE over here saying that, we're sort of really going to be the ones running the show, and you're not actually going to be in control of your agency or the bureau, and we're going to look to shut you down.
Yeah.
Why would I leave, the private sector to not even like run my own bureau, and with the goal of completely shutting it down? So I think Brian Johnson would be a good choice. Brian Levy as well. Because I'm a little bit more of an institutionalist, and I do think the CFPB has things it needs to do. The LO comp rule, let's say mortgage servicing rules don't get finalized. Like, I would like to see something come out that's sort of address what we've learned, post pandemic, and to reflect the modern sort of mortgage servicing industry. But if you have someone that is sort of just like a placeholder that doesn't really want to do anything, like, to me, that is worse than maybe someone who, would undertake some actions that I think, don't benefit the industry, needs to be the consumer, but on balance, could sort of, update and modernize regulations that I think need to be done. I don't know. I don't have any insight onto, whether Brian Johnson is interested or interviewing. I haven't seen any press reporting on who's really sort of, been to Mar-a-Lago or is considered a front runner for the CFPB.
Yeah. I heard Todd Zwicky was also in the running, that they were looking at him like, he was on a 2020 task force that, was going after regulatory overreach for the banks. So I heard
he's a law professor.
Yeah.
Who focuses on consumer finance issues.
Yeah, and that report, though, notably didn't call for the abolition of the CFPB, and had what I thought were some very good suggestions on CFPB areas of focus.
Sure.
And the report was issued near the end of the Trump administration, so it wasn't really followed through with Biden and Chopra. But that would be interesting too, because he is someone who is extremely well versed in the area of consumer finance and consumer protection law, but doesn't seem like someone who thinks that you should throw out the CFPB and just, and I know Elon talks about sort of, putting these functions back to their original regulators, but one of the reasons for the CFPB was that there was no federal regulator that really primarily focused on consumer protection. And you wonder if like the FDIC, OCC, all these other NCUA really want that kind of responsibility in addition to what they have now. So it'll be interesting to see, if you get sort of like some, bureaucratic pushback from other agencies that we don't really want to deal with this because it isn't our mission.
Yeah. What do you guys think about it doesn't look like Trump 2.0, they're re-upping old administrative positions. We don't see a lot of the old administration coming back. Maybe Stephen Miller might be back, but no shot of getting Kraninger back in. You think is that on the table?
I have no special knowledge, but it is sort of surprising that you haven't heard her name mentioned.
Listen, as great of an administrator as I thought she was, and of all the CFPB administrators, I'd put her at the top. I don't think she fits the mold of the leader that I was describing earlier, that is somebody that, is primarily focused on, making news headlines as opposed to, and reporting on those kinds of things, as opposed to
your
being
description
effective
sounds
manager.
more like Chopra. Maybe they should just keep him in.
Yeah, well, yeah, but for the policy positions, yeah.
Right.
Well, and Chopra has essentially intimated that, he serves a 5-year term. He serves at the pleasure of the president. So if the president asks him to resign, he will. But this was last week at the Senate Banking Committee hearing. So it sounds like he's going to stick around until Election Day and just wait for, Trump to ask him to resign. But I've sort of, internally thought it'd be funny if, Trump just like forgets to do it for a little while and Chopra's just still there for a week or two because they have no new nominee and, he's never been asked to resign. So
yeah, it could happen. It's not past the realm of possibility. So what about rule by enforcement underneath a new director? I'm hearing rumblings that probably what we'll see less of is fair lending. we're going to see less rule by enforcement of fair lending. We know there's some big cases popping up, some redlining cases that have been popping up. It seems to be the largest financial fines that have been getting issued have been around fair lending and discriminatory lending. And it seems like the rumor has it that we'll see that rule by enforcement kind of subside a little bit.
Well, so I took a note from the Townstone settlement recently, that I think I think we may have seen the apogee of fair lending enforcement, with, I think the enforcement interpretations that have been offered for these consent orders are, they were always subject to legal challenge, and nobody wanted to go to the mat on that because of the costs and the sort of the economics of fighting the federal government are not really great. But now you see, for example, Rocket and Dan Gilbert on this appraisal issue, an appraisal discrimination issue that they're now fighting with the federal government about that, and Dan's got a history of doing that, and frankly coming out pretty well because he's a billionaire and he can afford to do that. Most companies in our industry don't have that kind of iron will and dollars to back it to fight with the federal government. But I think that the tide has turned, I think, on fair lending, to your point, to your question. So whether we'll actually see some case law that comes out, because there's no case law on fair lending that gives us this interpretation. These have always been regulatory interpretations, enforcement interpretations.
Sure.
Whether we see that, I don't know, because I don't think there's going to be the will on the part of the government to try and fight for these interpretations that they've been using. So yeah, I think we may have seen the peak of fair lending.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
at least for the next 4 years.
right. Until the pendulum swings the other way, potentially.
Yeah, I think you may still see state AGs that pursue fair lending claims to the extent they can, but I think you're right, especially the cases that are sort of like Townstone, where it's I don't want to, I guess, quantify the severity of the allegations there, but it really felt like it was this sort of like tenuous allegations against theoretical prospective applicants. But there's a fairly large development in Texas called Colony Ridge, and there were allegations there that the lenders and the developers had taken advantage of Spanish-speaking borrowers. And there's actually also a lawsuit filed against that by the Texas State Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who's Republican. So I think you'll still see some action in that space, but I don't think you'll see sort of like the CFPB trying to really get a settlement where they can get a consent order and sort of push the industry in a direction without ever having to go to the mat and actually get a court ruling. So
Sure.
I think that you'll still see sort of I don't know what the government thinks is like the most obvious cases of discrimination or violations of fair lending, but I don't think you'll see them try to sort of make new policy through enforcement actions.
So potentially
I think
less jaywalking offenses.
The Colony Ridge is a great example of something that not a great. I mean, it's not great in that respect. It's an example of it is intentional discrimination, reckless disregard, and coupled with some kind of a unfair, deceptive kind of kind of preying on people because they have language issues or because they don't understand the culture or the legalities of things. I think that's very different than the kinds of sort of disparate impact,
Oh, I
and
totally agree.
discouragement kind of claims that, like the failure to locate an office in a particular place is somehow evidence of discrimination. Those kinds of, I think that evidence is very different than the evidence that they have in the Colony Ridge case. And I think those kinds of cases should continue to be brought by, the state or federal regulators, where you see, this kind of preying on vulnerable communities. But I think when you're being accused of not doing something unintentionally, that's where I think the fair lending laws are being stretched too far, and maybe we won't see too much of that.
Yeah, I think, what you saw in the past sort of under Chopra was that they look, and really there's the DOJ redlining initiative, so it's not just CFPB, but they look at your HMDA data and they compare you to your peers, and then that sort of sets off the initial hunt to see what's going on here. And I think you'll probably see much less of that, if not sort of it totally go away. I would expect the DOJ redlining initiative winds down with the Trump administration as well. But could be surprised, Scott Turner, who was appointed, or Trump says he's going to nominate as the HUD secretary. His background in housing is with these federal opportunity zones. So you may still see sort of, looking at fair lending issues more than we might sort of otherwise think. And Trump did very well with Latinos and a lot of people who are primarily Spanish speakers. So he may think that because this is sort of part of his base now, that's an issue that's important to them. So it's going to be important to his administration. But he really hasn't said anything about that now. So that's me sort of just prognosticating.
What do you guys think about FHFA then? Where are we going to go if we've had all this talk about the director for CFPB? What about FHFA? Are we going to see Calabria type policy? I think everybody is kind of waiting on the fact that we're going to see GSEs have an attempt to exit conservatorship. But in a 4-year administration, is that even possible?
Gosh, I mean, how much time do we have left in the call? Look, I don't personally think I'm the of what's going to happen with the GS. I think there's right now, the GSEs have been in government control for 16 years. I think 2 years ago, I wrote one of my musings about they are the government now. So do we want to have the two largest, well, actually three, if you throw in FHA, the three largest lenders in the country essentially run by the government? Well, is it an ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing? Or is it, gosh, this is really risky. We're going to run the risk of another bailout because we could have another crash. Those kinds of questions, I think, are really challenging. They involve congressional decisioning, which is always really challenging. I just don't know how much, effort is going to be put into that, even if it sort of fits with the MO of Trump and DOGE and everything, to just say, hey, let's privatize this and get it out of government control.
Yeah, I think you'll see, sort of initial talk of privatizing them, but you run into the problems that, there's a slim Republican majority in the House. Can they even, on this issue, get a majority? Are they really going to spend their limited legislative time on it? And really, if you totally privatize them, you lose through FHFA as the president a large, sort of lever to affect house prices and home, affordability and just general policy. And it's like, at the end of the day, do you really want to give that up for what I think everyone will assume is still at least an implicit guarantee that the government will bail out, Fannie and Freddie if it comes to it? I think that, I know Project 2025 talks about privatizing the GSEs and ending the explicit and implicit guarantee, but an implicit guarantee is, it's always going to be there. I don't think that you'll really get to that point. So I think at the end of the day, we probably won't get there. But I know Bill Ackman has been sort of around DOGE and talking to Elon, and he has a large position in Fannie Mae apparently. So, getting back to DOGE, like I think he would probably be a voice in the room saying, well, yeah, we need to privatize them. The fact that he'll probably make money off it is just, an additional benefit.
I think the thing you could see with a different direction, I mean, frankly, as sort of an arm of the government, they were sort of under all of the Joe Biden's administration's efforts at creating equity and fairness, and that was sort of their goals, right? Well, your goals are, okay, we want to see more housing equity, we want to see more housing fairness, as opposed to we want to expand home ownership for everybody. You make different decisions, and I think maybe it'll move more to the broader home ownership opportunities policy than maybe the equity policies. That's what I would predict.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, guys, it has definitely been insightful today. Totally enjoyed it. I want to thank our sponsor for this episode, mortgagelaw.com. And I look forward to doing this again next month, and we'll have definitely another engaging conversation right before the election.
Yep.
Or I'm sorry, right before the inauguration. Excuse me, right before the inauguration. I was like, wait, what election? Right? Yeah, right before the inauguration. So enjoy the holidays, and we will be back soon.
All right. Bye, guys.
The holidays.